The company was on the verge of collapse, buried under its own arrogance. Salvation came from the most unlikely place, a child hungry for knowledge. They tried to silence her with shame, but she answered with truth. The 47th floor conference room vibrated with a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Richard Miller, 32, adjusted his tie for the 5th time in 10 minutes, his brown eyes fixed on the documents spread across the mahogany table. The numbers didn't lie. Miller and Associates, the multinational corporation he had inherited from his father, was less than 24 hours from complete bankruptcy. "Mr. Miller, the Japanese representatives have arrived," announced his executive assistant Patricia through the intercom. Her voice trembled imperceptibly, a reflection of the panic that had seized all 53 floors of the building. Richard took a deep breath. This deal with the Japanese consortium, Takeshi Corporation, was their last chance. If he couldn't close the $200 million investment in the next few hours, more than 15,000 employees would lose their jobs, and he would be remembered as the man who destroyed a 40-year legacy. Meanwhile, in the basement of the same building, Carmen Diaz dried her trembling hands on her blue smock. At 38, she had spent the last 6 years cleaning offices to support her daughter on her own. That morning, however, she faced a dilemma that had kept her awake since 3. Mr. PS 188 had closed due to electrical problems, and she had no one to leave Isabella with. "Carmen, you know I can't allow this," said George Peterson, the custodial supervisor, shaking his grey head. "If someone from the executive floor finds out you brought your daughter—" "Please, George," Carmen interrupted, her voice cracking. "It's just for today. I promise she'll stay quiet in the 12th floor break room. No one will even know she's there." George looked at the woman in front of him. Carmen had never missed a single day, not even when Isabella had a high fever. She always arrived an hour early and left an hour late, never once complaining about the unpaid overtime. "All right," he relented, sighing heavily. "But if there's any trouble—" "There won't be," Carmen assured him, though her stomach was twisting into knots. Isabella Diaz, just 10 years old, held her mother's hand tightly as they crossed the marble corridors. Her large, dark eyes absorbed every detail of the luxurious environment, so different from her own reality. In her lap, she carried a worn-out notebook with yellowed pages and a cover patched with duct tape. "Remember, sweetie," Carmen whispered, kneeling to meet her daughter's gaze. "Stay in the break room, don't make any noise, and if someone shows up—" "I hide under the table," Isabella completed, nodding seriously. "Mom, it's going to be okay." The determination in the little girl's voice made Carmen's heart ache. Isabella had always been too mature for her age, taking on responsibilities no child should have. When Carmen worked double shifts, Isabella would make her own dinner, do her homework alone, and even look after the younger neighborhood kids. On the 47th floor, the meeting began under a suffocating atmosphere. Edward Fisher, the 45-year-old CFO, presented the numbers with a forced confidence that fooled no one. Beside him, 2 hastily hired translators struggled to keep up with the technical explanations. "As you can see," Edward gestured toward the projected graphs, "our forecast for the next quarter shows a significant recovery." The leader of the Japanese delegation, Hiroshi Takeshi, a 55-year-old man with an impeccable posture, frowned slightly. Something in the translation didn't make sense. When he mentioned the investment amount, the translator incorrectly converted the figure, turning 200 million into just 20 million. The difference was catastrophic. With $20 million, the company couldn't even pay off half its outstanding debts. Richard noticed the confusion on the Japanese men's faces, but he didn't speak the language well enough to identify the problem. "Is there an issue with the figures?" Richard asked, trying to maintain a professional tone as panic swelled in his chest. On the 12th floor, Isabella was sitting on a small chair in the break room, flipping through her precious notebook. In it were months of self-taught studies, Japanese verbs, English grammar structures, French vocabulary. She had started learning languages at 7, when she discovered a pile of donated books at her local library. The sound of raised voices reached her through the ventilation system. Isabella immediately recognized the words in Japanese. The numbers were being pronounced correctly, but something was wrong with the communication. Her heart raced, as she understood the magnitude of the error. Back in the conference room, the tension was peaking. Hiroshi tried to explain in English that there was a discrepancy in the values, but the lead translator, flustered by the pressure, only made things worse. Edward was starting to sweat visibly, and Richard felt control of the situation slipping through his fingers. "Perhaps we should take a break," Richard suggested, but Hiroshi shook his head. Their schedule was tight, and they had to fly back to Japan that same night. Isabella couldn't stay put any longer. She tucked the notebook under her shirt and left the break room, walking through the corridors until she found the conference room. The door was slightly ajar and she could see the chaos that had erupted inside. When Hiroshi repeated the amount in Japanese for the third time and the translator once again converted it incorrectly, Isabella didn't hesitate. Her clear, childish voice cut through the tense silence of the room. "Excuse me, but he's saying 200 million, not 20 million. All eyes turned to the door. There stood a young black girl in worn-out sneakers and simple clothes, clutching an old notebook to her chest. The silence that followed was deafening. Edward was the first to react, his face turning red with indignation. "What is this nonsense? How did a child get in here?" Carmen appeared seconds later, breathless and desperate. She had noticed her daughter was gone and had run after her. "Isabella, I'm so sorry, gentlemen, she shouldn't be—" "Get this kid out of here immediately," Edward yelled, standing up abruptly. "This is a serious company, not a daycare." But Richard raised his hand, signaling for silence. There was something in that girl's eyes, an intelligence that intrigued him. "Wait a moment," he said, looking intently at Isabella. "How do you know Japanese?" Isabella swallowed hard but kept her posture straight. "I study on my own, and the Japanese gentleman is right. He said ni oku, which means 200 million, not ni senman, which would be 20 million. Hiroshi's eyes widened, impressed not only by the correction but by the girl's perfect pronunciation. He said something quickly in Japanese, and Isabella replied in the same language, explaining the translation error that had occurred. The mood in the room changed drastically. Edward looked like he was about to explode. Carmen was trembling with fear, and Richard glanced back and forth between the girl and the documents, beginning to understand the scale of the problem that had almost destroyed them. "Impossible," Edward muttered. This child can't be right." But when Hiroshi confirmed with a nod that Isabella had correctly interpreted his words, the reality hit everyone like a lightning bolt. The deal that had seemed lost was still on the table, if they could fix the mistake in time. Edward Fisher felt the blood rush to his face as he realized a child had exposed his incompetence in front of the Japanese investors. His 20-year career, built on sucking up to his superiors and stepping on those below him, seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. "This is absurd," he exploded, slamming his fist on the table. "This woman brought a child here to sabotage our meeting. It's obviously all planned." Carmen flinched as if she'd been slapped. "Mr. Fisher, I would never do that. Isabella just—" "Shut up!" Edward roared, pointing an accusatory finger. "Do you think we're idiots? Some random cleaning lady and her daughter trying to fool us with this ridiculous act?" Isabella felt her legs tremble, but she kept her chin up. She had learned from a young age that showing fear only made things worse. Richard watched the scene with growing discomfort, but it was Hiroshi who broke the tense silence. "Excuse me," he said in English, addressing Isabella directly. "Could you explain the difference between the numerical systems you mentioned?" The girl looked at the Japanese man, then at Richard, seeking permission. When he nodded, she answered in fluent Japanese, explaining not only the numerical difference, but also the cultural implications of the terms used in business contexts. Hiroshi's eyes widened. He asked a few more questions, each more complex than the last, and Isabella answered with ease. The second member of the Japanese delegation, Kenji Yamamoto, joined the conversation, impressed by the girl's grasp of linguistic subtleties that few foreigners ever mastered. "Impossible," Edward repeated, but now his voice sounded less confident and more desperate. She must have memorized a few phrases. Any kid can do that. Richard, however, was fascinated. He excused himself and addressed Isabella in English, then in French. The girl responded promptly in both languages, demonstrating not just vocabulary, but an understanding of grammatical nuances. "How did you learn all this?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. Isabella hugged her worn-out notebook tighter. "At the public library in my neighborhood, they give away old books, and I like to study." "The public library," Edward sneered. "Right, because that's where people learn corporate Japanese, isn't it?" Carmen felt a mix of pride and terror. Pride in her daughter's intelligence, terror for the consequences it could bring. She had known Edward for years, knew how he treated anyone he considered beneath him. "Mr. Miller," Carmen said, her voice trembling, "please forgive the interruption. We'll leave right now." But Hiroshi raised his hand, asking them to stay. He spoke quickly with Kenji in Japanese, and Isabella automatically translated for Richard. They're saying the previous translation was completely wrong. It wasn't just the number, but also the contractual terms regarding collateral. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Richard looked at the official translators, who seemed to shrink in their chairs. If Isabella was right, the error went far beyond a simple numerical mix-up. "Prove it," Edward said, his voice laced with venom. "If this girl is as smart as you all think, let her prove it. Let her translate real documents, not just simple conversation." Richard hesitated. The situation was already embarrassing enough, but something in the Japanese men's determination made him decide. He handed Isabella a complex contract, filled with legal and financial jargon. To everyone's astonishment, Isabella read the document silently for a few minutes, making notes in the margins. Then she explained to Hiroshi in Japanese not only the content, but also identified 3 clauses that could be interpreted ambiguously, suggesting rewording that would protect both parties. Hiroshi and Kenji exchanged incredulous looks. In 20 years of international negotiations, they had never encountered a translator so precise and careful, and she was just a child. Edward realized he was losing control of the situation. "Enough!" he shouted. "I'm not going to stand here and watch this circus. This woman obviously trained her daughter for this charade." "What charade?" Richard asked, his patience wearing thin. "The girl just saved a $200 million deal." "Saved it?" Edward laughed bitterly. "She nearly ruined everything. If I hadn't controlled the situation—" "You didn't control anything," Richard cut him off coldly. "In fact, it was your incompetence that almost cost us everything." The words hit Edward like a series of slaps. Over the years, he had built a reputation based on intimidation and blaming others. He had never been confronted like this, especially not in front of outsiders. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Edward stood up abruptly. "I've worked for this company for 15 years. I will not be humiliated because of some filthy cleaning lady and her bastard child." The insult struck Carmen like a punch to the gut. Isabella felt tears burning her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had heard similar insults at school, on the street, in stores where her presence was viewed with suspicion. Richard felt a cold fury rise in his chest. "Get out of this room now," he said, his voice low but charged with authority, "and consider yourself suspended until further notice." "You can't do this to me," Edward protested. "I know all your secrets, Richard. If you fire me—" "Are you threatening me?" Richard asked, taking a step toward him. For a moment, the 2 men stared each other down. Edward realized he had gone too far, but his wounded pride wouldn't let him back down. "You're going to regret this," he muttered, before storming out of the room and slamming the door. The ensuing silence was broken by Hiroshi, who applauded softly. "Admirable courage," he said in English. "From the young lady and from you, Mr. Miller." Carmen was shaking visibly. "Mr. Miller, I'm so sorry for all this embarrassment. Isabella didn't mean to cause any trouble." "She didn't cause trouble," Richard replied, looking at the girl with something that resembled respect. "She prevented a disaster." But Isabella knew the power games of adults all too well. Edward wouldn't forget this humiliation easily, and people like him always found ways to get revenge on the powerless. "Can I ask a question?" Isabella said shyly, addressing Richard. He nodded. "Are you really going to protect us when he comes back?" The question hit Richard deeply. Here was a 10-year-old child who had saved his company, yet she was worried about retaliation. What kind of world was this, where a brilliant mind was afraid to shine? Before he could answer, his phone rang. It was Patricia, his assistant, and her voice sounded alarmed. "Mr. Miller, I need to speak with you urgently. Mr. Fisher just made a few calls. There are rumors spreading about the meeting. People are asking about irregularities at the company." Richard's stomach dropped. Edward didn't just know the company's secrets. He also knew how to use information to destroy reputations. And now he had clearly decided to attack. The war had just begun, and Isabella and Carmen were right in the middle of the battlefield. Over the next 48 hours, Miller and Associates turned into a silent battlefield. The rumors spread by Edward raced through the hallways like wildfire. Employees whispered in huddles, investors made nervous calls, and the financial press began to sniff out a potential corporate scandal. Richard had barely slept. Sitting at his desk at 5 in the morning, he reviewed the contracts and financial documents for the 10th time, searching for any loophole Edward could use against him. The deal with the Japanese had been signed. Isabella had truly saved the company. But now they faced a different problem. Their credibility was being undermined from within. "Mr. Miller," Patricia said, entering his office carrying a stack of newspapers and tablets. "The news isn't good." She spread the publications across his desk. Headlines ranged from irregularities at Miller and Associates to investors question transparency of U.S. multinational. None made direct accusations, but they all planted seeds of doubt that could destroy a reputation built over decades. "Edward worked fast," Richard muttered, running a hand through his hair. "He has contacts in the financial media." "There's more," Patricia said hesitantly. "I've received calls from 3 major clients asking for clarification, and the board of directors has scheduled an emergency meeting for this afternoon." Richard's stomach sank. The board was composed of old guard executives, friends of his father who had always viewed his youth with suspicion. If Edward could convince them there were irregularities in his management, they could remove him as CEO. Meanwhile, in the basement, Carmen tried to maintain her normal routine, but her hands trembled as she cleaned the windows on the 15th floor. Co-workers watched her with curious glances and a few malicious whispers. The news that her daughter had interrupted a major meeting had spread quickly among the cleaning staff. "I heard your girl stuck her nose where it didn't belong," commented Brenda, a veteran cleaner known for her sharp tongue. "Everyone knows poor kids who try to show off always end up making trouble." Carmen pretended not to hear, but each word was like a stab. She knew that kind of comment. Whenever someone from a poor neighborhood tried to stand out, voices would appear to push them back into the place society deemed appropriate. "I just hope you taught her to keep her mouth shut," Brenda continued, "because if she caused problems for Mr. Miller, we're all going to pay for it." At the private school where Richard had secured a scholarship for Isabella, the situation was no better. The principal, Mrs. Helena Moore, a 55-year-old woman with a perpetually stern expression, had summoned Carmen for an urgent conversation about the girl's inappropriate behavior. "Mrs. Diaz," Helena said, without offering Carmen a chair, leaving her to stand like a defendant before a judge. "We've been receiving concerning reports about your daughter." "What kind of reports?" Carmen asked, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. "Isabella has been presumptuous." Helena chose the word carefully. "She corrects teachers, asks questions that go beyond the curriculum, and demonstrates knowledge that frankly seems inappropriate for her age and background." Carmen felt her face burn. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. Isabella being smart is a problem?" "The problem, Mrs. Diaz, is that intelligence without humility can be seen as arrogance, and arrogance, especially from someone in her position, can cause discomfort among the other students and the families who support this institution." The message was clear. Isabella should know her place. She was accepted at the elite school as a favor, a charity case, and she was expected to behave with the silent gratitude expected of beneficiaries. "Furthermore," Helena continued, "information has reached us about an embarrassing situation involving your daughter at your place of work. We cannot have our reputation associated with—" "With what?" Carmen interrupted, finding courage she didn't know she had. "With corporate scandals," Helena finished coldly. At that very moment, Isabella was in the school library, alone as always. The other students avoided her, not just because of her humble origins, but because her intelligence intimidated them. She had learned to hide in books, where no one could judge her for knowing too much or for not having the right last name. But even her refuge was being invaded. A group of boys, led by Philip Anderson, the son of a major CEO, approached with malicious smirks. "Well, look what we have here," Philip said loudly enough for other students to hear. "The famous genius from the projects." Isabella kept her eyes fixed on the history book she was reading, trying to ignore them. "I heard you caused a huge problem at your boss's company," Philip continued. "My dad said your mum's going to get fired and you'll have to go back to the hole you crawled out of." "Leave her alone, Philip," said Marina, a classmate who was sometimes kind to Isabella. "Why? She likes to show off, doesn't she?" Philip laughed cruelly. "Sitting there pretending she understands Japanese, like she's so special." Isabella slowly closed her book. "I'm not pretending anything." "Of course you are," Philip stepped closer. "People like you only know how to lie and scam. That's what my dad always says." The words echoed exactly what Edward had said in the meeting. Isabella realized that it didn't matter where she was, at the elite corporation, the private school, or the low-income neighborhood where she lived. There would always be someone ready to remind her that she didn't belong. Back at the company, Richard received a call that changed everything. It was the family lawyer, Anthony Silver, SQ, a 60-year-old man who knew all the secrets of Miller and Associates. "Richard, I need to see you urgently." Anthony's voice was tense. "Edward has approached some members of the board. He's trying to form an alliance to oust you." "On what grounds?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. "He's alleging mismanagement and financial irregularities, but there's something more serious, Richard. He mentioned some contracts from the last 5 years that, well, they could look suspicious if interpreted maliciously." Richard's blood ran cold. There were contracts his late father had closed under questionable circumstances, deals that were technically legal but could be spun as favoritism or even corruption if scrutinized by someone with ill intent. "Anthony, are you saying Edward has real ammunition against us?" "I'm saying he can twist real facts to create a convincing narrative. And if the board decides to open a formal investigation..." The call was interrupted by Patricia, who rushed into the office. "Mr. Miller, there's a team of auditors in the lobby. They say they received an anonymous tip about irregularities in our international contracts." Richard hung up the phone, feeling the floor open up beneath him. Edward wasn't just spreading rumors. He had triggered an official investigation. The war had escalated to a level that could destroy not only his career, but his freedom. At that moment, on the 12th floor, Isabella was alone in the break room again, but this time, not by choice. Carmen had been temporarily reassigned to work on the lower floors, a veiled punishment for bringing her daughter on the day of the meeting. The school had suggested that Isabella spend her afternoons at the company until the situation normalized. Sitting in the same spot where it all began 3 days earlier, Isabella was flipping through her worn-out notebook when she heard familiar voices in the hallway. Edward was back, apparently accompanied by some allies from the board of directors. "The problem isn't just the girl," Edward was saying in a low but clearly audible voice. "It's a whole pattern of irresponsible behavior. Richard is losing control, making decisions based on emotion instead of business logic." "But the deal with the Japanese was a success," said a voice Isabella recognized as one of the board members. "That was luck," Edward replied quickly. "And even so, there was a leak of confidential information. How did some random child get access to the details of our negotiation? It suggests serious security problems." Isabella's heart pounded. Edward was twisting the facts, turning her help into an alleged security breach. And worse, she could hear conviction in the voices of the board members with him. "Furthermore," Edward continued, "I've discovered some irregularities in the contracts Richard has been signing recently. Inflated values, shell companies. If this gets out to the media, it will be the end of Miller and Associates." As the voices faded away, Isabella was left with a terrible certainty. The storm she had helped avert 3 days ago was coming back with triple the force, and this time no translation could save them. The board of directors meeting began at 3 p.m., but the tension had been building since noon. Richard looked at the serious faces of the 5 board members around the mahogany table, powerful men who had been his father's partners and who now judged him with hard, questioning eyes. "Richard," began Armando Costa, the chairman of the board, a 68-year-old man with white hair and a deep voice, "we've received some very disturbing information about irregularities in your management." Edward sat beside Armando, a thick folder of documents in front of him and a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had worked methodically for 3 days, gathering every questionable contract, every decision that could be spun negatively. "What kind of irregularities?" Richard asked, keeping his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. "Starting with Monday's incident," Edward spoke up, opening the folder. "A serious security breach allowed confidential information from our negotiation with the Japanese to reach unauthorized third parties." "Are you referring to the little girl who corrected the translation error?" Richard asked incredulously. "I'm referring to the fact that some random child had access to secret financial details of a $200 million deal," Edward retorted coldly. "How was that possible? Who else might have access to our information?" Dr. Fernando Lopez, another influential board member, shook his head with concern. "Richard, that really does suggest serious flaws in our security protocols." "The girl saved the deal," Richard protested. "Without her, we would have lost the investment." "Or was it all planned?" Edward insinuated, flipping through the documents. "A cleaning lady brings her daughter on the very day of the most important negotiation of the year. The child magically appears knowing Japanese and solves our problems. Isn't that a little too convenient?" Armando frowned. "What are you suggesting, Edward?" "An information leak," Edward said gravely. "Someone could have sold our data to competitors, and when they realized it would jeopardize the deal, they used the child to correct it and divert suspicion. The accusation was as absurd as it was brilliant. Edward had taken a positive event, Isabella saving the deal, and twisted it completely, turning it into evidence of a conspiracy. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Isabella was facing her own tribunal. Principal Moore had called a meeting with the parents of students who felt uncomfortable with the girl's presence at the school. "It's not a personal issue," said Sandra Anderson, Philip's mother, an elegant woman with perfect nails and a politely cruel voice. "But our children come from traditional families. They aren't accustomed to certain situations." Carmen sat on an uncomfortable chair in the corner of the room, listening as 5 wealthy mothers discussed her daughter's future as if she were a problem to be solved. "The issue is that Isabella has knowledge that seems inappropriate for her age," said Monica Ferraz, another influential mother. "My son came home saying she knew things about international economics that even he hasn't learned yet. Where would a child from the inner city learn that?" "She studies a lot," Carmen answered timidly. "Studying is one thing," Mrs. Moore intervened, "but demonstrating knowledge that goes beyond what's expected can cause insecurity in other students. They might feel inadequate." The irony was cruel. Isabella was being punished for being too smart, for knowing more than was appropriate for someone of her background. The mothers spoke about her as if she were an anomaly that needed to be controlled or removed. Perhaps it would be better if she attended a school more suited to her profile, Sandra suggested delicately. "There are excellent public schools in the area." Carmen felt tears burning her eyes. These women were trying to expel Isabella from the school using polite words and fake smiles. But the message was clear. People like them didn't belong in that environment. On the 12th floor, Isabella was hidden in the break room again when she overheard another conversation that made her tremble. The auditors had found something. "The problem is more serious than we thought," said a male voice she didn't recognize. "There are signs of overbilling in at least 8 contracts from the last 3 years." "All signed by Richard?" asked another voice. "No. Most were negotiated by his father before he passed away, but Richard ratified them when he took over as CEO. If used correctly, Edward can claim that Richard was aware of the irregularities and chose to maintain them." Isabella's stomach churned. His father had left Richard a poisoned inheritance, and now Edward was using it to destroy him. Worse still, somehow it was all being connected to her presence at Monday's meeting. Back with the board, Edward presented his final piece of evidence with the theatrics of a seasoned prosecutor. "These contracts," he said, spreading documents across the table, "show a clear pattern of overbilling and favoritism. Millennium Construction Company, a $50 million contract for a service the market offers for $35 million. Santos and Silver Imports, prices 40% above the industry average. Global Tech Solutions, payments for services never rendered." The board members examined the papers with increasingly worried expressions. "Edward," said Dr. Lopez, "these contracts were closed when Richard's father was still alive." "Exactly," Edward replied quickly, "but they were renewed and ratified by Richard after he became CEO. He knew about the irregularities and chose to keep them. Why? Because he was receiving kickbacks to look the other way." "That's an absurd lie," Richard exploded, jumping up from his chair. "Is it a lie?" Edward retorted, pulling one last document from his folder. "Then how do you explain this $2 million deposit into your personal consulting firm's account 2 days after the contract with Global Tech was signed?" The silence that followed was devastating. Richard looked at the document and felt the floor disappear from under his feet. The deposit was real, but there was a perfectly legal explanation for it. It was payment for legitimate consulting work his firm had done for another client, but explaining that now would sound like desperation. "I can explain that deposit," Richard began, but Armando raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Richard, in light of the evidence presented, the board has no choice but to temporarily suspend you from the CEO position while a formal investigation is conducted." "You can't do this," Richard protested. "There are explanations for all of these documents." "I'm sure there are," Edward said with false compassion, "and you'll have the opportunity to present them during the investigation. But until then, the company needs unquestionable leadership." Armando nodded gravely. "Edward will assume the role of interim CEO until this situation is resolved." Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. In less than a week, he had gone from the company's savior to a suspected felon. And the worst part was that he couldn't prove his innocence without revealing secrets that would compromise his late father's reputation. Meanwhile, at the school, Isabella finally snapped. After a week of enduring taunts, whispers, and uncomfortable stares, she couldn't stay quiet any longer when Philip said that kids from the projects are only good for cleaning toilets and stealing. "You're an ignorant jerk," she shouted, standing up from her desk. "Just because your parents have money, you think you're better than everyone." The entire classroom fell silent. Philip smiled, realizing he had gotten the reaction he wanted. "Look at that," he said theatrically. "The little maid is angry. What are you going to do? Tell your cleaning lady mum?" "At least my mum works honestly," Isabella shot back, tears of rage in her eyes. "She doesn't live off leeching money from other people like you do." The teacher walked into the room at that exact moment, finding Isabella on her feet, shouting, her face red with indignation. She didn't see Philip's provocations, didn't hear the insults that led to the outburst. She only saw a poor, out-of-control girl yelling at a classmate from a respectable family. "Isabella Diaz!" the teacher exclaimed, shocked. "Go to the principal's office immediately!" As Isabella walked through the school hallways with tears streaming down her face, Richard was leaving the company building carrying a box of his personal belongings. They had both been defeated on the same day, victims of a system that punished anyone who dared to challenge the unwritten rules of power. And Edward watched it all from his new presidential office, savoring a victory that had taken years to plan. But there was one detail he didn't know. Isabella had overheard all his conversations in the break room, and her brilliant mind was already connecting dots that could change the entire game. 2 weeks after her expulsion from school, and with Carmen officially fired from Miller and Associates, Isabella and her mother faced the cruelest reality of their lives. The small 2-room apartment in the Bronx had never felt so cramped and desolate. Carmen sat on the bed she shared with her daughter, holding a stack of overdue bills. Without her job, their savings would be gone in less than a month. She had knocked on dozens of doors looking for work, but word had spread quickly. She was the troublemaking cleaner who had caused a scandal at a major corporation. "Mum," Isabella said softly, watching the despair on her mother's face. "It's all going to be okay." Carmen forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course it will, sweetie. It always is. But Isabella could see the tears her mother tried to hide. She could see how Carmen picked at small pieces of food during meals, so there would be more for her. She could see how she lay awake late at night, staring at the ceiling, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up. In Edward's mansion in a wealthy Connecticut suburb, the situation was quite different. He was in his private study, celebrating with a glass of 1995 French wine as he reviewed the latest company reports. In 2 weeks as interim CEO, he had consolidated his power and begun implementing changes that benefited his personal allies. The phone rang. It was Marcio Williams, his private accountant, a thin 50-year-old man known for his creativity with numbers. "Edward, we have a problem." Marcio's voice was tense. "The auditors are getting dangerously close to the Millennium and Global Tech contracts." Edward paused with the glass halfway to his lips. Those contracts were central to his scheme. Shell companies created specifically to overbill for services and generate illegal commissions that funded his lavish lifestyle. "Have they found anything?" Edward asked, trying to stay calm. "Not yet, but they're asking the right questions. And there's something else. Richard is investigating on his own. He hired a private investigator." Edward felt a stab of irritation. Even on suspension, Richard was still a threat. What kind of investigation? "He's trying to prove that the questionable contracts were manipulated by you, not him. If he finds evidence—" "He won't," Edward interrupted coldly. "I was very careful. All trails lead back to the old man or to Richard." But even as he said it, Edward felt a growing unease. There was something about that girl that bothered him. The way she had appeared at the exact right moment, speaking fluent Japanese, knowing technical details that few adults mastered. She was too smart to be ignored. Meanwhile, Richard was in his Upper East Side apartment, surrounded by documents and spreadsheets. He had spent his savings hiring Marcus Perry, a former FBI agent who now worked as a private investigator. Marcus had uncovered some interesting information about the suspicious contracts. Global Tech Solutions was registered 4 years ago, Marcus explained, spreading photos and documents across Richard's dining table. The registered address is a virtual office in Manhattan. No real employees, no physical structure. It's a classic shell company. And who are the owners? Officially, a couple of straw men who don't even know their partners. But I followed the money trail, and all the payments end up in accounts linked to Edward or people close to him. Richard felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief at having evidence that could exonerate him, anger at realizing how long he had been manipulated by Edward. "There's more," Marcus continued. "I found out Edward has a history. He was fired from a multinational in 2018 on suspicion of embezzlement, but he managed to bury the case with out-of-court settlements. Then why did my father hire him? Because Edward is very good at what he does. He can make numbers add up on paper even when they don't in reality. Your father probably didn't know about his schemes." While the adults played their power games, Isabella had developed her own strategy. Every day she walked to the public library and used the free computers to research Miller and Associates. She had discovered something no one else had noticed: patterns in the dates of the suspicious contracts. Sitting at a grimy library table, her worn-out notebook open beside her, Isabella had created a detailed timeline. All the questionable contracts had been signed during specific periods. When Richard's father was in the hospital, when Richard was traveling, or when there were crises that diverted attention. "Edward always took advantage when no one was looking," she muttered to herself, making notes in the notebook's margins. But her most important discovery came by chance. While researching Global Tech Solutions, she found an old newspaper article mentioning that the company had been hired for a service that was never performed. The article included a photo of the contract signing, and Isabella recognized one of the people in the picture. It was Marcio Williams, Edward's accountant, misidentified as a Global Tech representative. Isabella's heart pounded. There it was, proof that Edward was directly connected to the shell companies, but she was just a 10-year-old girl. Who would believe her? That night, Carmen came home after another fruitless day of job hunting. Their savings were gone, and she had made the most painful decision of her life. "Isabella," she said, sitting beside her daughter on the bed, "I need to tell you something." Isabella saw the desperation on her mother's face and knew it was serious. "We have to move," Carmen continued, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I can't afford the rent here anymore." "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, though she already knew the answer. "My sister in Cleveland said we can stay with her for a while, just until I find work there." Isabella felt her world collapse. Cleveland was over 400 miles from New York. It meant leaving behind everything she knew, but most importantly, it meant abandoning her investigation into Edward when she was so close to uncovering the truth. "When are we leaving?" she asked, trying not to cry. "Next week. I already bought the bus tickets." That night Isabella couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of the small room, thinking of Richard being destroyed for crimes he didn't commit, thinking of Edward celebrating his victory, thinking of all the other people who would be harmed if the scheme continued. At 3 in the morning, she made a decision that would change everything. She got up quietly, took her notebook and a pen, and began to write a letter. Not to Edward, not to the police, but to the auditors who were still investigating the company. In the letter, Isabella explained everything she had discovered, the suspicious contract dates, the connection between Edward and the shell companies, the photo that proved Marcia Williams's involvement. She included her detailed research, her observations from the conversations she had overheard, and her conclusions about the corruption scheme. But Isabella knew that an anonymous letter from a child wouldn't be taken seriously. She needed something more dramatic, something that would force everyone to pay attention. As she wrote, an audacious plan began to form in her mind. It was risky, probably impossible for a 10-year-old girl to pull off, but it was her only chance to save Richard and expose the truth before it was too late. When she finished writing, Isabella folded the letter carefully and hid it inside her notebook. Tomorrow was Monday, and Edward would be making his first official presentation as CEO to the Japanese investors who were returning to sign additional contracts. Isabella smiled for the first time in weeks. If Edward wanted to play a game of manipulation and lies, she would show him how a 10-year-old girl could play it better. Monday, 7:30 a.m. Isabella was hiding behind a pillar at the entrance of the Miller & Associates building, watching the flow of employees arriving for another workday. Her plan was simple, in theory but terrifyingly complex in practice. She had to get into the building without being recognized, make her way to the conference room during Edward's presentation, and publicly expose her findings. The problem was that all the security guards had been instructed not to let her in. Edward had made sure of that. Isabella adjusted the beanie she had found and lowered her head, trying to look invisible. At 8:15 she saw her chance. A group of new interns was being led by a hurried supervisor. Isabella blended into the group, walking with the same haste and staying behind the others. "You have 20 minutes to organize the presentation materials," the supervisor said as they entered the elevator. "CEO Fisher wants everything perfect for the Japanese investors." Isabella felt a pang of irony. The same investors she had helped 2 weeks ago would now witness her desperate attempt to save Richard. On the 47th floor, Edward was in his new presidential office, adjusting his tie in front of a mirror. He had slept poorly the last few nights, plagued by a growing paranoia. The auditor's investigation was getting dangerously close to his schemes, and Richard was asking uncomfortable questions through his private investigator. "Mr. Fisher," Patricia entered the office carrying a folder. "The representatives from Takeshi Corporation have arrived. They're waiting in the conference room." "And the auditors?" "They're still reviewing the global tech contracts. They said they need a few more days to finalize their report." Edward nodded, trying to hide his nervousness. A few days were all he needed to finalize the new contracts with the Japanese and transfer the money to offshore accounts. After that, even if they discovered his crimes, he would already be financially secure. Meanwhile, in the basement of a small accounting firm, downtown, Carmen was cleaning offices for a miserable wage. She had gotten this temp job through an agency but knew it wouldn't last. Her thoughts were constantly on Isabella, who had acted strangely that morning, leaving the house earlier than usual with a vague excuse about going to the library. "Oh God," Carmen muttered to herself, "please protect my daughter." On the 12th floor, Isabella had managed to reach the familiar break room without being detected. Her heart was beating so hard she feared someone might hear it. She opened her worn-out notebook and checked her notes one last time. Everything was there. The dates of the suspicious contracts, the photo of Marzio Williams, the connections between Edward and the shell companies. But she still didn't know how she would get to the conference room. The 47th floor was highly restricted, and the elevators required a key card for the executive floors. The answer came when she heard familiar voices in the hallway. Hiroshi and Kenji, the Japanese investors, were being escorted by an assistant toward the elevators. Isabella took a deep breath, stepped out of the break room and approached them. "Takeshi-san," she said in Japanese, startling the men. "The young translator," Hiroshi exclaimed, recognizing her immediately. "What a surprise to see you here." "I need to talk to you about something very important," Isabella said quickly in Japanese. "It's about the contracts you're about to sign." Kenji frowned. "What kind of problem?" Isabella looked around, checking if they were being watched. "The man who is giving the presentation today is not trustworthy. He is involved in fraud." The two Japanese men exchanged worried glances. In the business world, accusations of corruption were extremely serious. "Do you have evidence?" Hiroshi asked. Isabella showed him her notebook. "I have everything here, but I need you to take me to the conference room. It's the only way to expose the truth." Hiroshi hesitated. It was an extraordinary situation, a 10-year-old girl making serious accusations against the CEO of a multinational corporation. But he remembered Isabella's stunning accuracy from 2 weeks ago, and his gut told him to trust her. "Come with us," he decided. On the 47th floor, Edward was finalizing his presentation when Hiroshi, Kenji, and Isabella walked into the room. The girl's presence sent a visible shock through Edward, who instantly paled. "What is this girl doing here?" Edward demanded, trying to maintain his composure. "She asked to accompany us," Hiroshi replied calmly. "She claims to have important information regarding our negotiation." "Information?" Edward laughed nervously. "She's just a child who caused trouble before. She shouldn't even be in this building." But Isabella was already opening her notebook, her hands trembling slightly as she organized her documents. "Gentlemen, the man who is trying to do business with you is a criminal." The silence in the room was absolute. Edward felt the blood drain from his face. "She doesn't know what she's talking about," Edward tried to intervene. "She's a disturbed child who—" "Let her speak," Kenji interrupted, intrigued. Isabella took a deep breath and began her presentation. In fluent Japanese, she explained how she had discovered the pattern of fraudulent contracts, always signed when Richard was absent or distracted. She showed them the dates, the amounts, the connections between Edward and the shell companies. "And this photo," she said, showing the newspaper page where Marzio appeared, "proves that Edward's personal accountant was representing Global Tech Solutions, one of the shell companies." Hiroshi examined the photo carefully, then looked at Edward, who was visibly sweating. "These are very serious accusations," Hiroshi said in English. "And completely false," Edward exploded. "Are you going to believe a 10-year-old girl over an experienced executive? This is ridiculous." "Then explain this photo," Kenji said coldly, pointing to the image in the newspaper. Edward looked at the photo and felt his world collapsing. He had completely forgotten about that photographic record, a small article in a local paper that had seemed insignificant at the time. That must be a mistake," Edward stammered. "Marzio was there for other reasons." "What other reasons?" Isabella asked in English, her voice firm despite her age. "He was representing a company that doesn't exist, receiving payments for services that were never rendered." At that moment, the conference room door opened and Richard walked in, accompanied by Marcus, the private investigator, and 2 official auditors. Richard had been monitoring the building, waiting for an opportunity to confront Edward. "Perfect timing," Richard said, looking at Isabella with admiration. "I see you reached the same conclusions we did." Edward realized he was cornered. "This is a conspiracy," he shouted. "You set this all up." "Did we?" one of the auditors questioned, consulting a thick folder. "Mr. Fisher, we've just uncovered suspicious bank transfers that correspond exactly to the information this young lady has presented." Isabella felt a mix of relief and terror. Her plan had worked. Edward was being exposed. But she also knew she had put herself in danger. Edward was a powerful and desperate man. "You're all going to regret this," Edward muttered, his gaze fixed on Isabella. "Some girl from the projects can't destroy the lives of important people." It was then that something unexpected happened. Carmen appeared at the door, breathless and desperate. "Isabella," she cried, running toward her daughter, "I've been looking all over the city for you." The sight of her mother made Isabella finally break down. All the tension and courage she had mustered dissipated, and she was once again just a 10-year-old child who had gotten involved in dangerous adult matters. "Mom," she sobbed, running into Carmen's arms. "I had to do it. I had to tell the truth." Carmen hugged her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "I know, sweetie. I know." But even as she comforted Isabella, Carmen noticed the look of pure hatred Edward was directing at them. She knew that kind of look. It was the look of someone planning revenge, and Edward was already planning. Even if he went to prison, even if he lost everything, he would make sure Isabella and Carmen paid for ruining his life. He had contacts in the criminal underworld, people who owed him favors, ways to make their lives a living hell. The truth had been revealed, but the war was just beginning. 3 days after Edward's exposure, Miller and Associates was plunged into controlled chaos. Journalists surrounded the building, federal agents searched the offices, and employees whispered nervously in the hallways, fearing for their jobs. Edward had been arrested in his own presidential office, handcuffed in front of the Japanese investors, and led away under a barrage of camera flashes. Newspaper headlines splashed his face with titles like "Corrupt Executive Exposed by 10-Year-Old Girl" and "Child Prodigy Uncovers $1 Million Scheme." Richard was back as CEO, but his first week was marked by emergency meetings with lawyers, auditors, and government regulators. The company was technically saved, but its reputation had to be rebuilt brick by brick. "The damage is extensive," explained Anthony Silver, the family lawyer, during a meeting in Richard's office. "Edward embezzled nearly $50 million over 5 years. We'll be able to recover some of the money, but it will be a long process." "And Isabella?" Richard asked, genuine concern in his voice. "How is she?" "That's the problem," Anthony sighed. "The media exposure has turned her into an unwilling celebrity. Reporters are trying to interview her. There are offers from TV shows, even book deals. But there are also—" "What?" "Threats. Edward has powerful allies who lost a lot of money when he went down. They're blaming Isabella for everything." Meanwhile, in the small apartment in Cleveland where Carmen and Isabella had finally moved, life was far from the celebration one might expect. Carmen had found a cleaning job at a private school, but the salary barely covered their basic expenses. Isabella sat on the back porch of her Aunt Maria's house, flipping through a local paper that had published a twisted version of the story. The headline read, "NYC Girl Invents Story for Fame and Fortune." "Don't pay any attention to that, honey," said Aunt Maria, a 45-year-old woman with calloused hands and a generous heart. "People like that will always try to tear down anyone who does the right thing." But Isabella couldn't ignore it. In the past few days, she had received dozens of calls from journalists, TV producers, and even people offering money for her story. Some were genuine, but many were clearly attempts at exploitation. The worst were the anonymous messages that arrived at her aunt's house. Unmarked letters with phrases like, "Girls who stick their noses where they don't belong end up hurt," and "You ruined the lives of important people. You're going to pay." Carmen tried to hide her worry, but Isabella noticed how she double-checked the locks before bed, how she glanced nervously at cars that drove slowly down the street. "Mom," Isabella said on a hot Thursday afternoon, "do you think we did the right thing?" Carmen stopped folding laundry and looked at her daughter. "Why do you ask that?" "Because everything got worse after. You lost your job, we had to move, people are threatening us. Maybe I should have just stayed quiet." Carmen knelt in front of her daughter, holding her small hands. "Isabella, you saved an honest man's company and exposed a criminal. What happened after isn't your fault. It's the fault of a world that punishes people for doing the right thing." But even as she said it, Carmen wondered if it had been worth it. They had lost everything. Their home, their job, their stability, their safety. And for what? So the truth could come out? Sometimes she caught herself wishing Isabella had simply stayed quiet in the break room that fateful day. In New York, Richard faced his own dilemmas. The company was recovering financially, but he couldn't forget the girl who had risked everything to save him. He had tried to contact Carmen and Isabella several times, but they had changed their phone number and address. "You need to find them," Patricia said during a meeting. "The press is turning this story into a soap opera. They're saying you abandoned the girl who saved you." "This isn't about the press," Richard replied. "It's about justice. She lost everything because of me." "Technically, she lost everything because of her own actions," Patricia corrected. "No one told her to get involved." Richard looked at his assistant with a hard expression. "She got involved because she saw an injustice happening. And now she's suffering the consequences of doing the right thing." Meanwhile, in a federal prison, Edward received an unexpected visitor. Marcio, his accountant, had managed to flee to Uruguay before being arrested, but maintained contacts in the US through intermediaries. "Things aren't looking good for you," said the visitor, a criminal defense attorney known for taking on impossible cases. "But there are still ways to get a reduced sentence." "How?" Edward asked, clinging to any shred of hope. "A plea deal. Give up the politicians and businessmen who were involved in the scheme, and you could cut your sentence in half." Edward considered the offer. He did know other corrupt individuals had proof of even larger schemes, but there was a problem. If he turned on them, they would become his mortal enemies. And powerful enemies had ways of getting revenge, even from inside prison. "What about the girl?" Edward asked suddenly. "What girl?" "Isabella Diaz, the little brat who ruined my life." The lawyer frowned. "What about her?" "I want her to suffer. I want her and her mother to pay for destroying me." "Edward, you're talking about a 10-year-old child. That would be—" "She's not a normal child," Edward exploded. "She's a demon in disguise. If it weren't for her, I'd still be CEO of the company." The lawyer realized he was dealing with a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. Edward wasn't just angry. He was obsessed with getting revenge on a girl who had simply told the truth. "Let it go," the lawyer advised. "Focus on your defense." But Edward had already made his decision. If he was going to spend years in prison, he would at least make sure Isabella and Carmen suffered too. He had contacts, favors to call in, people who didn't ask questions about the age of their victims. In Cleveland, Isabella woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of shattering glass. She ran into the living room and found a rock amidst the broken shards of the window with a piece of paper tied to it. The message was simple and terrifying. "We know where you live." Carmen appeared seconds later, having heard the noise. When she saw the message, her face went completely pale. "We're packing," she said in a trembling voice. "Now." "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know, but we can't stay here." As they packed their few belongings in the middle of the night, Isabella wondered if she would ever have a normal life again. She had exposed the truth, saved a company, brought about justice, but the price was her own safety and happiness. At 4 in the morning, mother and daughter slipped quietly out of Aunt Maria's house, carrying 2 backpacks with everything they owned. They didn't know where to go, didn't have enough money to hide for long, and had no one powerful to protect them. Isabella looked back one last time before getting into the cab that would take them to the bus station. Somewhere in the darkness, dangerous people were planning to hurt them, and all because a 10-year-old girl had the courage to tell the truth. The cab disappeared into the Cleveland dawn, carrying 2 fugitives toward an uncertain future. But what they didn't know was that, at that very moment in New York, Richard was making a decision that would change everything. He had finally decided to use all his power and influence, not only to find them, but to protect them permanently. 2 weeks after fleeing Cleveland, Carmen and Isabella were staying in a cheap motel in Chicago, living on what little money they had left and unsure of their next move. Carmen had found a few odd cleaning jobs, but the income barely covered their daily expenses. Isabella spent her days reading books borrowed from the public library, trying to keep her mind busy and forget the constant fear she felt. She had stopped dreaming about the future focusing only on surviving one day at a time. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning that everything changed. Carmen had gone out to look for work when there was a knock on the motel room door. Isabella looked through the peephole and saw a well-dressed man in a suit accompanied by a professional-looking woman. "Isabella Diaz," the man asked when she cautiously opened the door. "My name is Marcus Perry. I'm a private investigator. And this is Fernanda Oliveira, an attorney. We were sent by Richard Miller." Isabella felt a mix of relief and suspicion. "How did you find us?" "It wasn't easy," Marcus admitted, "but Richard mobilized every available resource to locate you. He's very concerned about your safety." "And why should we trust you?" Isabella asked, displaying a maturity that still surprised adults. Ms. Oliveira showed an official ID and some documents. "Because Richard has discovered who is behind the threats you've received, and because he has a proposal that could completely change your lives." When Carmen returned and found the two visitors, her first reaction was panic, but as she saw the documents and heard their explanations, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. "Richard wants to see us?" Carmen asked, still wary. "More than that," Marcus explained. "He wants to ensure you never have to run or hide again. But to do that, he needs Isabella's cooperation." "What kind of cooperation?" Isabella questioned. "You need to give an official deposition about everything you discovered about Edward," Ms. Oliveira explained. "With your testimony, we can increase his sentence and completely dismantle the corruption network he commanded." Isabella's stomach churned. "That means we'll be more exposed, won't it?" "In the short term, yes," Marcus admitted. "But in the long term, it will be the guarantee that Edward can never hurt you again." 3 days later, Isabella and Carmen were in New York, staying in a luxury hotel with 24-hour security, all expenses paid by Richard. It was the first time in weeks they had been able to sleep without fear. Richard visited them the next morning, and Isabella was surprised to see how different he looked. The arrogant executive had been replaced by a humble man who carried the weight of the responsibility he felt for them. "Isabella," he said, sitting in the armchair across from her, "first, I want to apologize for everything you've been through because of me." "It wasn't because of you," Isabella replied. "It was because of Edward. But it was my company, my responsibility to protect someone who did the right thing," Richard insisted, "and I failed at that." Carmen watched the conversation in silence, still processing the dramatic change in their circumstances. "I want to make you a proposal," Richard continued. "But first I need to tell you something we discovered about Edward." He opened a folder and showed several documents to Isabella. "Our investigators found that Edward wasn't just stealing from the company. He was involved in a much larger scheme with politicians and other businessmen. The money he stole was used to fund political campaigns in exchange for inflated public contracts." Isabella examined the documents, her brilliant mind quickly connecting the dots. "That's why he's so desperate to get revenge on me. It's not just about the company. It's about the entire scheme that fell apart." "Exactly. And that's why he's so dangerous," Richard confirmed. "But we also discovered something else. He was blackmailing several important people. We have evidence that he forced at least 3 CEOs to participate in his schemes through blackmail." Carmen frowned. "What does that have to do with us?" "It has everything to do with it," Richard smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "Because the people Edward blackmailed are willing to testify against him, as long as they're guaranteed protection. And with Isabella's testimony about her discoveries, plus the depositions from these blackmail victims, Edward will be sentenced to at least 25 years in prison." Isabella felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "And the threats? They'll stop," Ms. Oliveira assured them, joining the conversation. "Because Edward will be transferred to a federal supermax facility with no possibility of outside communication, and his allies will be more worried about protecting themselves than pursuing you." Richard leaned forward. "But there's more. Isabella, you didn't just save my company. You exposed a corruption scheme that was hurting the entire country. The federal government is interested in your case." "Interested how?" Carmen asked protectively. They want to create an educational program based on Isabella's story, Richard explained. A project to encourage young people to report corruption. It would be well paid and would give Isabella access to the best education available in the country. Isabella felt tears welling in her eyes. And my mom? Your mother would be hired as the program's administrative coordinator, Richard smiled, with a salary and benefits far superior to what she earned as a cleaner. Carmen began to cry, unable to believe what she was hearing. But there are conditions, Richard continued. You'll have to give occasional interviews, participate in educational events, and Isabella will have to maintain high grades in school. What school? Isabella asked. Whichever one you choose. Private, public, or even an international school. All expenses will be covered. Isabella looked at her mother, who was smiling through her tears. Mom, what do you think? I think our life is finally changing for the better, Carmen replied, hugging her daughter. 6 months later, Isabella was enrolled at the Dalton School, one of the best schools in New York, where she was respected for her intelligence and not discriminated against for her background. Carmen worked for the Youth Against Corruption program, coordinating educational activities in public schools across the state. Edward had been sentenced to 30 years in prison, and his corruption scheme had been completely dismantled. 7 politicians and 12 businessmen were indicted, and more than $200 million was recovered for the public treasury. Isabella had become a respected figure, invited to speak at schools and universities about ethics and civil courage. Her worn-out notebook had been digitized and was on display at the Museum of Corruption, created by the federal government to educate future generations. I never imagined I'd be recognized for studying, Isabella said during an interview for an educational magazine. I always thought my intelligence was something that would get me rejected. Miller & Associates had fully recovered and become a model of corporate transparency. Richard implemented whistleblowing programs and ethics education that were copied by other multinationals. Isabella taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it, Richard said, during a ceremony where Isabella received a Medal of Honor from the federal government. And that intelligence and courage can change the world, regardless of the age or background of the person who possesses them. That night, in the comfortable apartment where they now lived on the Upper East Side, Isabella was sitting at the dining table doing homework. Carmen watched her with a smile, still getting used to the idea that they no longer had to worry about bills or safety. Mom, Isabella said, looking up from her books, do you think we made the right choice that day at the company? Carmen walked over and kissed her daughter's forehead. Sweetie, you always make the right choice. Sometimes it takes a while to see the results, but the truth always wins in the end. Isabella smiled and went back to her studies. Her eyes shone with the same knowledge as always, but now there was something more. Hope. Hope for a future where her intelligence would be valued, where her background wouldn't define her limits, and where doing the right thing would always be rewarded. Outside, New York City carried on with its bustling nightlife, but in that brightly lit apartment, a girl who was once invisible was now studying for a brilliant future, protected by her mother's love and the certainty that she had found her place in the world. The girl who saved a company had finally saved herself.